all-women short men fantasy story. To the Coen brothers, Luke and Cal, the house was a perfect setup for two undersized high school dropouts whose only apparent means of support was to turn to lives of petty crime. Sitting alone and isolated at the end of a private road in a deserted section of a remote New York City suburb with no telephone lines to the house and inhabited only by a single woman, it seemed easy picking for the brothers. What their surveillance had failed to reveal to them, however, was the fact that its single female resident was Irina Markova, a 35-year-old Ukrainian immigrant who was a towering 6 feet 8 inches, 275 pounds mountain of feminine beauty and muscle. A former female bodybuilder, WNBA star and, most recently, a champion professional female wrestler. She possessed the physical strength and agility of 6 strong men, which the brothers, at 5 feet 2 inches and 130 pounds each, were not. As the brothers, both of whom were armed with .45 semi-automatics, jimmied the front door to gain entry to her house, Irina, who had been working out in her basement gym, heard the noise and came up to the front hall to confront and challenge the intruders, looming above them like a giant, female colossus. Startled, the brothers whirled, and at the sight of this giant, powerfully muscled Amazon towering before them reached for their guns. As they drew, however, Irina, with the speed and dexterity of a cat, caught their gun hands in a crushing grip, mashing their hands with agonizing force against their guns and paralyzing their trigger fingers so they could not fire while simultaneously lifting them bodily almost 2 feet off the floor to hold each of them, helplessly dangling in midair from a single, mighty arm and powerless against her overwhelmingly superior strength. Almost immediately Irina felt their fingers open so that she could release their hands and transfer her hold to the guns. As the two men dropped to the floor, groaning and massaging their crushed and numbed hands, she transferred the guns to a safe place out of reach of the smaller men and then reached down to grasp each of them by the throat and again lift them to hold them effortlessly at arm-feet's length almost 2 feet above the floor. As she continued to hold the two men off the floor, her fingers probed for nerve centers at the backs of their necks which she pressed just hard enough to render the brothers unconscious. Then, tucking them both under a single, mighty arm, she carried them downstairs to her private gym. Carrying the two men past a long row of exercise equipment, weight benches, barbells and weights to the opposite wall which divided the basement into 2 sections, she dropped Cal to the floor and laid the unconscious Luke on his back across her thighs and began removing his clothes in preparation for substituting them with one of 2 special harnesses consisting of leather straps, wrist and ankle cuffs and leather sandals. Each of the cuffs contained sturdy metal fasteners which enabled them to be hooked together or over straps to render the wearer completely helpless. Each outfit was also fitted with thick metal rings on the chest and back which held the leather straps in place. Once she had finished putting Luke into the harness, Irina slipped her forefinger through his chest ring and, with the strength of only that single finger, effortlessly lifted his 130 pounds, unconscious body off her thighs and carried him to one of 2 hooks embedded in the wall which divided the room and unceremoniously slid his back ring over the hook, leaving him hanging more than a foot above the floor like a side of meat. Then she returned to Cal to do the same with him and stepped back to wait until the 2 helpless men regained consciousness. When they finally did, it took them several minutes to realize their predicament. Then they began screaming, struggling fruitlessly to free themselves and shaking their fists at Irina, who regarded their helpless fury with unconcealed amusement. Sliding her forefingers through their chest rings, Irina plucked them off the wall to hold them effortlessly at arm-feet's length. As the 2 men continued to kick and struggle, they suddenly realized that she was holding each of them so easily in midair with only the strength of 1 finger. The realization of the power of this mighty woman struck them with stunning force, and they could only gape in awe and gasp in dismay at their predicament. Smiling serenely, Irina carried the 2 men back to the weight bench, sat down on it and neatly arranged their helpless bodies face down across her massive right thigh, trapping their own thighs with her left and resting her right arm across their backs to hold them in place as she prepared to administer their punishment. Such was their amazement and consternation at the ease with which she handled them that neither of them thought to resist or protest until they were secure. Only then did the realization of what she intended to do to them hit them, but she laughed at their feeble protests. With methodical and casual precision, Irina Feet's big left hand descended with incredible power and stinging force on the two men Feet's unprotected buttocks, producing screams of pain and pleas to stop from both. Held in place so tightly they could not even struggle, they had no choice but to continue to endure agony and humiliation as the double spanking continued for what seemed to the brothers to be an interminable time. Finally, when their buttocks were almost numb from the pain, Irina stopped, turned the two men over on their backs, and, sliding her forefingers through their chest rings, lifted them off her thighs and carried them to hang them unceremoniously back on the wall. As the brothers hung on the wall, their heads and eyes downcast in pain and humiliation, Irina busied herself rearranging 6 heavy one-hand dumbbells which had been laying on the floor in front of the weight bench, 2 of which dumbbells were significantly larger than the other 4. The weights were also unusual in that their ends were not round, but rather each end had 5 flat sides which would prevent them from rolling. On the floor nearby were also 6 metal clamps, the interiors of which were lined with thick leather pads, which she also arranged next to the dumbbells. By this time the brothers began to notice what she was doing, and as she quickly removed her gym outfit and then, completely naked, approached the two men to secure Feet's hands to his body straps and his feet together and lift him off the wall, their expressions reflected their perplexity and apprehension at the kind of further treatment that might be forthcoming from this towering, titanic woman. The plans she had in store for them quickly became apparent as Irina carried Cal to one of the sets of weights and laid him down on his back in the center of the arrangement. Straddling his thighs, she quickly placed the open clamp next to the 125 pounds weight around the bar of the weight and then secured his ankles and feet inside the clamp so they were effectively imprisoned over the weight Feet's bar. Then, releasing his left hand from its bondage, she forced it out to the 75 pounds weight and, after wrapping his hand around the bar, secured it there with the clamp. After similarly securing his right wrist and hand, she rose to her full height and casually surveyed his feeble attempts to move the weights. Still, to be sure, she knelt down over him and tickled his ribs, forcing him into frantic convulsions of screaming laughter as he struggled vainly to pull the hand weights to him to protect his sides from her probing fingers. Satisfied that Gal was completely helpless, Irina rose and returned to the wall to collect Luke. After securing Luke Feet's wrists to his body straps and his ankles together as she had Feet's, Irina plucked him off the wall and carried him with one hand behind his back and the other around his ankles over to the second set of weights and laid him down in the middle of the arrangement, securing his wrists and ankles to the weights. Then, satisfied that he could not move any of the weights either, she rose to her full height to loom over the helpless men as they stared up at her, their eyes wide with apprehension as they wondered what she had in store for them next. They didn't have long to wait. Moving to stand over Gal, her massive legs on either side of his tiny body, she bent down and grasped the 2 weights securing his wrists and effortlessly pulled him upright, his sandal-covered feet precariously balanced on the weights securing his feet. Then, pulling him forward slightly, she lowered the 2 weights to the floor, effectively bending him almost double. A groan escaped his lips as he struggled to lift the 2 weights off the floor, but his comparatively puny strength was nowhere near equal to the task. A satisfied smile decorating her lovely features, Irina turned her attention to Luke. Grasping the 2 weights securing his wrists, Irina pulled him up off the floor and then dropped the weights to the floor as she had with California. Then she stepped around behind the 2 helpless men and playfully fondled their upturned buttocks, smiling at the expressions of agonized humiliation on their faces. Then, as Irina slid her huge hands under their stomachs, the 2 brothers realized in abject horror what she was about to do and knew that her strength was such that she could easily lift both of them and the attached weights off the floor. They were also sure that their helpless bodies could not possibly support those weights and that they would literally be torn limb from limb. With casual ease, Irina rose to her feet and lifted the two men to shoulder level. Ignoring their screams of agony at the unbearable pain the weights were inflicting on their shoulders, wrists and hips. Were it not for the interior padding of the clamps and the tightness around their feet and hands, which kept their fingers wound tightly around the bars of the weights, surely their hands and feet would have been torn from their bodies. As it was, however, the pain was excruciating. But Irina had more in mind than just lifting their helpless bodies. Effortlessly, she hoisted the two men higher, holding them at arm-feet's length above her head, and then slowly pumped them up and down, carefully increasing the pressure on their already tortured bodies without pulling their arms and legs apart until they were ready to faint from the pain. Finally, after what seemed to the brothers to be an eternity of agony, she lowered them to shoulder level and then to the floor. As she put them down, however, it became clear that she was not finished with them. Stepping away for a few moments, she returned to stand in front of them, a huge double dildo protruding from between her legs. Gaping up at this terrible sight, the brothers could only groan in helpless horror at the ordeal they knew would follow. Stepping around behind the two men, she bent down and slipped her arms around their waists. Then she straightened her legs, lifting both men and the weights to which they were attached off the floor and maneuvered them so she could insert the huge dildos into their rectal cavities. The brothers screamed in agony as the combined strain of the weight on their limbs and the tearing of their anuses racked their helpless bodies with unbelievable pain. Ignoring their screams, Irina effortlessly raised and lowered their over 800 pounds of weight to bring her to each plateau of pleasure until her final, explosive climax. Then lowering the two men back to the floor, she removed the double dildo from her vagina and their anuses and cast it aside. As their senses continued to reel from the torture they had suffered, she removed the clamps and weights and, after donning her gym outfit, lifted them to carry them back to the wall and slide their limp bodies over the hooks. Satisfied that they were secure, she went upstairs to the kitchen to call her friend, Mickey Kravitz, a policewoman with the NYC police force, to inform her of her captives. The next morning Mickey arrived in an oversized police SUV as Irina, having retrieved the brothers from her basement and using their harnesses to double them up, was standing on her front lawn casually tossing them up and down as though they were beach balls. The sight was enough to make Mickey wonder what else Irina might have done to them, so she asked to inspect one of them. As Irina obliged and, with a casual sweep of her mighty right arm, sent Cal somersaulting through the air into Mickey Feet's waiting hands, the tall, powerfully muscled policewoman explained that the only way to ensure that the brothers were punished for their crimes was to keep them imprisoned in Irina Feet's house. Irina Feet's initial reaction was both puzzled and negative, but before expressing her concern she waited for Mickey Feet's explanation. For the next several moments, however, the policewoman seemed more interested in inspecting with obvious approval the helpless, little man held effortlessly at arm's length in front of her. When Mickey explained the rationale for her suggestion, however, Irina enthusiastically agreed. Mickey unfolded Cal, but kept his ankles locked together and his hands secured to his body straps to prevent him from trying to take her gun and then set him on his feet. Where she was forced to hold his shoulders to help him keep his balance. He stared up in awe at this powerfully muscled policewoman who, in her high-heeled boots, was almost as tall as Irina and seemed capable of handling his small body as easily as Irina had. Hearing the two giantess' feet decision, however, prompted a quavering plea for more humane treatment than the brothers had experienced in Irina Feet's hands. In the meantime, Irina had similarly unfolded Luke, but continued to hold him off the ground with her left hand. The two giant women carried their tiny captives back into the house and down to the basement to hang them back on the wall. Then they retrieved the disassembled steel cage parts from the police van, carried them down to the vacant second room in the basement, where they assembled them into two massive, secure cages, complete with locking doors. Returning to the van, they collected the two beds and portable toilets and installed them in the cages. Satisfied that the cages would provide escape-proof sleeping quarters for the brothers, they decided to have a little fun with them and returned to pluck the two men off the wall. Cradling the brothers in their powerful arms like small children, Luke in Irina Feet's arms and Gal in Mika Feet's, the two giantesses carried them upstairs to the master bedroom and laid them side by side on the double bed there. Then, quickly stripping off their clothes, they settled down over their captives, their massively muscular frames so completely enveloping their tiny bodies that the two men quivered in terror as they all but disappeared from view. Despite their fear, however, both men could not help but react to the pressure of the women astride them and quickly produced throbbing erections which the women immediately captured and took inside them. For the next half hour the giant women worked the helpless men under them, controlling their desire and preventing their premature ejaculations by clamping down on them with their vaginal muscles as they progressed through their several plateaus of orgasmic pleasure toward their own final climaxes. When they came, they carried their captives with them in mutual orgies of orgasmic ecstasy beyond anything the men had ever experienced and well beyond what Irina had expected from their undersized penises. When their rapture and passion finally subsided, both women rose up to sit on the edge of the outer bed and cuddle their diminutive, and now completely tamed and worshipful captives tightly against them on their laps as it was gently explained to them what would be expected of them and what their lives would be like as love slaves of their giant captors. To illustrate the point, the two women dressed and carried their men down to the kitchen, where pretty pink aprons were added to their attire and they were placed in front of a sink piled with dirty dishes which they were ordered to and did dutifully. If unhappily, washes and dry. Afterward they were required to clean the floor, countertops and cabinets before they were swept up off their feet and carried bodily down to the basement where the women deposited them in their respective cages for the night. And, as they stood looking silently up at their giant female captors, the brothers wondered if life imprisonment in this private prison would be so bad after all.